The DCEU has ended. Spanning 16 movies and one TV show, this universe has been conflicted. Through ups and downs, it's generated a lot of discussion and interest for DC. Now that we're in between DC cinematic universes, we have the perfect opportunity to look to the past, as well as to the future, to get a new perspective on the DC extended universe. So, throughout 2024, I will be politely forcing my friends to watch all 17 DCEU projects with me, and then writing video essays on each. For this video, we'll be going over the first two entries, Man of Steel and Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. We'll be using the Ultimate Edition because, according to the director, that's, well, the ultimate version of the film. I'm not particularly interested in dogpiling these movies, as there's already enough of that on the internet. Instead, I'll be trying to find some balance between the good and the bad. There's a lot to be said about both of these films. This video will be primarily focused on ideology and the ideas, just because I think that's the most interesting element to focus on, and I don't really want to waste everyone's time. But, before we get into the movies, I've got a bone to pick with the online film analysis community. A lot of film analysis comes down to what we call the formal elements. This refers to the way in which the intended meaning is put to film. Think narrative, mise-en-scène, cinematography, editing, and sound. Now, don't get me wrong, I think this is massively valuable, and it definitely adds something to the conversation when it comes to film analysis, but it also kind of misses the point, in my opinion. Art tells a story. How this story is conveyed differs per art form, sometimes per individual project, but there tends to be some kind of language to it. In the case of literature, that tends to be language. In the fine arts, this is a wide variety of techniques in the sphere of color, shape, and the tools used to create the art. The film lies somewhere in between. The audiovisual elements are used to convey the broad message, where dialogue and specific actions fill in the details. These complement each other to tell the story of the film. This means that the way we view film, even down to what the story is, can differ per person. Of course, art is subjective, but that's not just in how we value it. Everyone's way of analyzing and understanding the audiovisual elements of art is different. There are a bunch of differences between different cultures, like the way that red tends to signify danger in the West, but could mean luck in Southeast Asia. To bring this just a little further, it also means that the quality of form elements isn't necessarily relevant to a discussion about how good a film is. As long as it achieves its goal of telling the story it's supposed to, it has achieved its purpose. Take, for example, Superman the movie, a film plenty of people adore. It's far from visually perfect, not like perfection is possible in art, but that's alright. The core of any film lies more in the content, the story, the writing and directing. Given that looking at film is subjective, there's also a multitude of ways to read the intentions of a director. This brings us to ideology. What are beliefs presented by a film? What is the meaning we can derive from it? Ideology isn't explicit in the majority of film. Instead, it's encoded. Using Stuart Hall's model of encoding and decoding, ideology is encoded into a piece of media through the previously mentioned language of film. That piece of media is observed and understood by different people in different ways. It's decoded through the understanding of the people that consume it, leading to a whole bunch of different interpretations on the basis of factors like education and sociocultural context. In Hall's model, we usually talk about three types of readings: preferred, negotiated, and oppositional or critical. Take as an example Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Drew Jeffries wrote and published an article arguing that this film was in line with #AllLivesMatter and in fact cemented Peter Parker's role as the definitive Spider-Man as asserted by Avi Arad years prior. This might be more than a bit surprising for those familiar with the movie. It's a pretty interesting article that makes a few good points about the industry. I recommend it even if I disagree with its premise. This take is a perfect example of a critical or oppositional interpretation. This was not necessarily the way it was encoded into the film, but it's a valid way of analyzing the movie nonetheless. A preferred reading is on the other side of the spectrum. It takes the meaning as it was encoded at face value, in accordance with the intent of the director. Negotiated readings would be somewhere in between, accepting some preferred meaning while being more critical of other aspects. This video is a negotiated reading. While writing it, I noticed myself defaulting into a critical position, but I did my best to switch gears and add some preferred elements throughout. With that said, I've wasted enough time jibber-jabbering about media theory. Let's get into the movies themselves. Alright, as I said, I don't want to be too one-sided when it comes to these movies, so let's start with some things that I liked. With a few exceptions, the castings in these films are excellent. Henry Cavill, Ben Affleck, Michael Shannon, Jeremy Irons, Amy Adams, Lawrence Fishburne, hell, I'd even argue that Jesse Eisenberg is a good casting for this version of Lex. Leaving aside for a moment how I feel about the characters themselves, there is no denying that someone cooked with these castings. There's also no getting around how good the music is. Hans Zimmer cooked on Man of Steel especially. There's not much else to it, it's just fire. The cinematography, special effects, and editing was generally really good. Even if the message it presented wasn't something that I found myself agreeing with or liking, the movie looks really good. This is especially apparent in the opening on Krypton and in the Fortress of Solitude, where the alien designs could really flourish. If there's one thing that Zack Snyder is good at, it's absolutely cinematography. He knows how to get something to look good. Mise-en-scène is divided into 4 categories. Firstly, elements of design. This is the costumes, makeup, set design, and the props. There seems to be a lot of agreement on how good some of the suits and other designs look. Same with the designs of the more alien elements on Krypton and the Fortress. Second, the lighting. Say what you will about how dark the movies are, both tonally and visually, but the lighting is generally used fairly effectively. Batman, for example, is frequently lit fairly minimally. There's like 17 different ways of analyzing this based on the context and other factors, but given that BVS revolves around Batman being a dark Punisher-esque anti-hero who learns to be a better hero through Superman, this dark lighting plays into that very well, as the light represents Batman's wisdom and heroism. Next up, we have composition. This is used fairly well, nothing especially good or bad to say about it either way, just was good. Finally, kinesis. Kinesis refers to the movement of characters and objects on the screen, including facial expressions. Again, this is strong. A lot of this goes to the actors who, as mentioned previously, were cast terrifically and gave incredible performances. A lot of the form is excellent. These movies look great, and it's clear everyone gave their all to make them what Snyder wanted, and I really respect that. It takes a lot of effort from hundreds of people to get a film like this to the point it got to. An essential part of Man of Steel is the dichotomy between humanity and Kryptonians. Clark has to choose between his environment, Earth and humans, and his heritage, with General Zod and the potential new Krypton. Conceptually, this is fine. Not something I care for when it comes to Superman, but it's not outwardly bad. The issue comes in how it's presented. The way I see it, this choice lies with one of 3 things. It's either Clark's perception of humanity, his perception of Krypton, or his perception of himself. Clark is never shown to have a solid connection to his birth planet. Aside from the few moments after his birth he spent on the dying planet, he spent his entire life on Earth with humanity. His only connections to Krypton are one conversation with Jor-El, a robot in a spaceship. Hell, even that didn't go well. He's specifically told that a Kryptonian society was one that didn't have choice. The robot tries to kill him, and then Lois, Jor-El straight up tells him that he's as much a child of Earth as he is a child of Krypton. Whatever connection he might have with Krypton is immediately dissolved. So, maybe it's his perception of himself. That makes the most sense from a narrative perspective, but we never really get a solid moment of Clark reflecting on his own role in all of this. We see his immediate reaction to finding out he's not from Earth as a child. That could be some indication, but is ultimately more of a visceral emotional response than a real stance. The only other moment we get is the scene in the church, where he spends the majority of the time talking about humanity and Kryptonians, not his own state of mind. The focus is put on the 2 species, not on Clark himself. It's not about his perception of Krypton or his perception of himself, so the weight of the choice must lie in his perception of humanity. They bullied him, they acted destructively to one another, they told him he maybe should have let kids die. The only real exceptions to this are Lois Lane and Jonathan Martha Kent, who at least show some interest in protecting or helping Clark. The choice presented to him is not one of being with humans or Kryptonians, or even liking humans or Kryptonians. It's helping the Kryptonians terraform the Earth to make it unlivable for humans, or keeping the Codex, which has the genetic template of every Kryptonian yet to be born, away from Zod, which would limit the survival of the Kryptonian race. Clark makes the decision in a second. His first words upon realizing that Zod plans to terraform Earth into New Krypton are, "I can't be part of this." He's against it from the start. He's never even attempted to reconsider, because the remaining hour of the movie is mostly spent on action sequences. The emotional question is resolved around the halfway point of the film. Surely, if we want the choice between humanity and Kryptonians to be this important, there would be more deliberation on what Clark would choose. Instead, he makes his choice in an instant and continues to punch people for an hour. Because the core question is resolved by this point, this spectacle feels empty. There's not much to it. Superhero. A heroic character with a universal, selfless, pro-social mission who possesses superpowers, extraordinary abilities, advanced technology, or highly developed physical and/or mental skills, including mystical abilities, who has a superhero identity embodied in a codename and iconic costume, which typically express their biography or character, powers, and origin, and is generically distinct, i.e. can be distinguished from characters of related genres by a preponderance of generic conventions. This definition, taken from Coogan and Rosenberg's 2013 article, highlights the issue with Snyder's approach to superheroes. Snyder prioritizes the cool factor. There's no denying that he's passionate about comics, but from the interviews that I've seen of him, it doesn't seem like he's that interested in superheroes. He prefers deconstructing them. Sure, this thing makes a hero, but what if we take it away sentiment? I personally find this incredibly dull. Sure, if we take the good out of good person, you're left with just a person, but that was still there before. I don't understand the tendency to take the idealistic traits away from superheroes, because that's what makes the character a superhero. You can still tell that story about the person without cutting the hope and the inspiration. To, as the director of a movie with two of the biggest characters in fiction, go on a tirade about how you're living in a fucking dream world if you want an idealistic, hopeful character to be, idealistic and hopeful, is absolutely wild. To read two comics and misinterpret both of them just to make movies fumbling some of the most culturally significant characters out there, it's disappointing. Snyder's versions of these characters tend to come off as closer to anti-heroes than superheroes. Anti-heroes are protagonists that are conventionally unlikable and unheroic, the Punisher and Red Hood being prime examples. When all your heroes are violent and grim, it sends the message that being violent and grim is heroic, especially when it's Batman and Superman, the two most iconic superheroes of all time. It's a similar effect to what the MCU has been doing for a while. A lot of the MCU's heroes kill fairly indiscriminately and fairly frequently. That's been scaled back as of late, but at the time you could say fairly that this affinity for murder from superheroes tells us implicitly that this death is part of the universal selfless pro-social mission that is so core to these heroes. I will say that the DCEU takes some active steps to prevent this conclusion from being created, more so than the MCU does, but only in the sense that it never establishes the alleged hero, Batman, as having a universal, selfless, pro-social mission. In short, Batman in BVS is not a superhero. But The Dark Knight Returns, no! Batman did not kill anyone in The Dark Knight Returns. He does in BVS. Snyder said as much.
I tried to do it like by proxy. He'd shoot the car that they're in, the car would blow up, or the grenade would go off in the guy's hand or whatever. Or he'd shoot the tank of the thing, and the guy pretty much lights his own tank with the thing. So I perceive it as not him killing directly, but by sort of, if the bad guys are associated with the thing that happens to blow up, that's not really... He would say that that's not really my problem, like they shouldn't have been around that.
Although he somehow considers it indirect, even though we see him run the Batmobile through people and explode cars with people inside. Okay, so take Superman, a character that, all things considered, likely qualifies as a superhero. Superman is aggressive, violent, and brooding. Now, I don't know about you, but this sounds like an absolutely perfect role model for the next generation to aspire to. I'm sure this doesn't feed into any toxic gender roles or anything like that. Yeah, I think it's super selfless and pro-social to be super violent and aggressive. Sounds like a great thing to glorify. Not understanding superheroes is fine. Might be a good idea to not make movies about them then, let alone with the two biggest ones. One of the biggest issues in these films that everyone and their mother have talked about at this point is that the characters are horribly adapted. Whatever qualities these films do have are barely, if at all, applicable to these characters, as they are in the source material. As we've talked about throughout the previous segments, Superman and Batman's heroism is twisted in an unnatural way. Batman kills people and uses guns, and Superman is an edgy, grim, military-adjacent figure. But that's just the obvious part. The majority of these characters are out of character, not just the main ones. I talked at length in a previous segment about the choice Clark makes between humans and Kryptonians. It's arguably very Superman to never doubt his faith in humanity. What isn't very Superman is the fact that he doesn't try to find a third option. It's almost painfully obvious to at least try to find a different planet for the Kryptonians to live on. Zod isn't exactly the most rational character, so obviously it wouldn't work out, but it would still show an attempt from Clark to find a solution for everyone instead of choosing one group. Snyder has made a point of creating situations where heroes have to make a difficult decision. Whether it's Clark choosing between humanity or Kryptonians, Batman choosing between killing and letting people die, even if that choice is implicit. What makes these characters special, and what is missing from Snyder's world, is that the characters, the superheroes like Batman and Superman, find a third option, and if there isn't one, they make one. It's not about realism, it's about hope. It's about finding a way to make things work out, even if the odds are stacked against you. That's the point. Clark's relationship with both the Kryptonians and humans is wildly different from the source material. His apparent disdain for humanity, even if temporary, is wild. Superman isn't the messiah to Kryptonians that he's presented as in these films. He isn't their salvation. His connection to humanity has always been far stronger than his connection to the Kryptonians. He only spent all of 5 minutes on Krypton, after all. This connection to the planet and people he was born into fits more with Supergirl than with Superman. Supergirl spent years on the planet and saw the death of her people. When she arrives on Earth, the divide between her life on Earth and her heritage is much stronger. Man of Steel is chock full of religious messaging. Whether it's visuals, storylines, or dialogue, there's plenty of examples. The same can be said about Batman v Superman. The whole Jesus allegory for Superman has been debated to death, and I'm not really looking to get into that in detail. If you're interested, there's a series of videos by Pillar of Garbage that explains it in a good amount of depth, so go watch that. There's, again, plenty of discourse surrounding Snyder's Batman. And that makes sense. There's plenty to talk about. The whole killing thing is only one part of it. It being a bad adaptation of The Dark Knight Returns, it being a bad idea to adapt The Dark Knight Returns for the main DC cinematic universe, blah blah, we get it. Instead of going on and on, mindlessly hating this version of the character, I want to take a moment to talk about what makes Batman a good character. Now, I'm hardly Batman's biggest fan, but the best versions of Batman and stories involving him all have one thing in common. Well, two things. Compassion and hope. A lot of the discussion about Batman tends to follow the same patterns. Oh, he's cool, and he punches, and he detective, which is fair enough, those are parts of the character, but it kind of misses the point. Same with the Superman stuff we just talked about. A hero's purpose is to enact positive change, however broad that is. The Batman is a dark, brooding pessimist take is a bit annoying, not just because it's patently untrue if you look at the character in some of its best iterations, but because it fundamentally misses the point. One of the issues with Man of Steel, and to a lesser extent Batman v Superman, that I can't stand is its insistence on its shitty understanding of adoption and parenthood. Clark was adopted. To make a Superman movie while shitting on adoption is not only a bad adaptation of the character, it's also incredibly disrespectful to all the characters and creators involved. Now, to be fair, there is this bit of Jonathan Kent saying that he is, in fact, Clark's dad.
Pretending I'm your son?
You are my son.
However, this sentiment is undercut by Jonathan not appearing in that many scenes. When we only see him in 3 flashbacks and then he dies, there's not much time to establish this. I'd say that simply saying Clark is Jonathan's son is plenty for a Superman movie that doesn't focus on that, but it just so happens that this movie focuses on that. When you make that part of Clark's arc and repeat that he doesn't see himself as a child of Earth or of Ma and Pa Kent, it all falls flat. But even then, all that's irrelevant because Jonathan takes it back afterwards. To force the narrative of choosing between humanity and Krypton into the film, a number of changes were made to the Superman mythos. We've already talked about the changes to Superman as a character. Another major change is the role of Clark's parents. All of them. The roles of Jor-El and Ma and Pa Kent are, to some degree, swapped. Jor-El is the one who motivates Clark to help others, while Ma and Pa Kent act more as a hindrance in that direction, with both of them saying, at least to some degree, that maybe Clark shouldn't help people.
Or be none of it. You don't owe this world a thing.
In the source material, this is, of course, very different. Ma and Pa Kent play this supportive role. Jor-El isn't necessarily an obstacle to it, but encourages it in a very different way that sometimes can be bad in the context of the story. If there's one character aside from Clark you have to nail to get a good Superman story, it's Lois Lane. Not only the love interest, but also a driven reporter that acts as a foil for Clark's relentless optimism and wide-eyed farm boy shtick. Snyder's vision got the relentless journalist part, sort of. I'm not really a fan of introducing Lois Lane in the Arctic. That being said, some of her actions are in line with the character. Disobeying a direct order to drop a story to continue investigating, giving a story to an outside source because Perry won't print it? Yeah, that makes sense, that's Lois. I'm somewhat disappointed by Lois's role in the story, though. She's essentially only relevant in the first half of Man of Steel and the very start of Batman v Superman, before fading into the background in both of them. Her relentless journalism is dropped beyond her investigation of Clark. Her character is only given any time of day when it works to prop up Clark. The one exception to this is the start of Batman v Superman, where she randomly goes to Africa to talk to a dictator or something. It's vague and mostly irrelevant, but that does work to prop up Lois as a character. Lois doesn't really challenge Clark in any meaningful way. In Man of Steel, she somewhat prods him to come out to the public, but she quickly backs down when she actually talks to him. From there, she's just a little reckless at the beginning of Batman v Superman. There's not much of a back and forth between them. We're told that they're important to each other, sure, but I don't buy it because there's no meaningful connection there. Talking at length about Wonder Woman for these movies is somewhat pointless, as she has all of 7 seconds of screen time and she has 2 whole movies that we'll be getting to soon. Only thing I will say is that there's a lot of emphasis on her sword, and I don't really like that. We can be done with the whole warrior Wonder Woman and get to what the character actually stands for. Lex Luthor is a weird case in these movies. He's supposed to be a play on the Silicon Valley type rich boys, and it kind of succeeds at that, if not purely because of Jesse Eisenberg, whose previous role in The Social Network clearly factored into this. I don't love this, as it kind of takes away from Luthor's relationship to Superman. There's definitely some stuff that this version of Lex gets right. His hatred for Superman is clearly blossoming in the right way. I don't know, it feels almost wrong to judge this Lex on the merit of his appearances in BVS, as this is clearly not the full story with him. And to be honest, the same goes with a lot of these characters. But we can't really do anything else. That being said, this is still a separate project. If we can't analyze a single text on its own, it has failed to properly tell its story. Divergence in adaptation isn't necessarily bad. It does have to be earned. More importantly, it has to be respectful. This is another source of major discourse, both when it comes to Snyder's comic book movies, other comic book movies, or even something entirely different. My take on it is this. An adaptation should be not the exact same thing as what it's adapting. That's incredibly boring and kind of invalidates the original in a way. So, if you're adapting a story that already exists somewhere else, be sure to make some changes. But don't change too much. The core of the characters and story still have to remain intact. It can't be mean-spirited toward the original. When an adaptation of a character or story makes it clear that it's embarrassed of the original or dislikes the original, that takes away from its quality as an adaptation. Let's quickly run through a few examples before applying this to Man of Steel and Batman v Superman. Avatar: The Last Airbender's first season in live action is an example of a text that ticks all these boxes. It makes plenty of changes without losing the core of the characters or story, and it's anything but mean-spirited toward the animated series. Even if it does have a couple of missteps in how it changes some of the events from the original, it doesn't fundamentally lose the essentials. Next up, the MCU's portrayal of Scarlet Witch. It makes plenty of changes, that's big thumbs up, but some changes go too far away from the original. Leaving to the side for a moment that she's Jewish Roma in the comics, and the MCU just completely ignores that to make her white, the struggle she went through in the comics is simplified to fit the narrative of a half-adaptation of House of M that doesn't even have the M. If there's any example of losing the plot in an adaptation, it's this. I definitely say it's mean-spirited too when they erase so much of the character, especially her ethnicity. Moon Knight kind of fits in the same box as Scarlet Witch, taking away the character's Jewish heritage and creating a fairly incomplete image of DID, changing the core of the character and disrespecting the origins. Something similar happens in Arrow, not changing the ethnicity of the character, but taking away the things that make them who they are. Green Arrow's comedic elements, political stances, and blunt personality are all inherent to the character. Arrow took that away and didn't take the necessary steps to make it a good adaptation. And that's only the main character, by the way. That's not even mentioning Black Canary or the Speedies or anyone else. If your adaptation of a superhero is so bad that the character doesn't qualify for the word superhero anymore, that must tell you enough about the quality of that adaptation. As for Superman, if we take the dark, brooding edgelord from these films as a good adaptation of Superman, we might as well stop the conversation here, because that shit doesn't even try to come close to what Superman is about. That being said, it's crucial to discuss this in relation to what story is being told. If an adaptation of a character is bad, that's that. But if they're trying to make a statement about that character, what makes it special, by removing that part of the character, it's a whole different conversation. And I would love to afford that level of charitability to these movies. Sadly, I've seen Zack Snyder talk about them. The version of these characters that Snyder made serves not to highlight some point about superheroes as portrayed in recent media, but to support his own worldview. They're dark and gritty because being hopeful and optimistic isn't cool, because it's realistic to have them be brooding, because Batman having a no-kill rule is living in a fucking dream world. That's not to say these views can't be the backdrop for an interesting story, it just doesn't work here. There's no effort to balance it with the values these characters represent beyond a surface level. The people loved Superman actually, that only happens after he dies. There's just nothing there. And sadly, that makes sense. Snyder was never out to make a superhero movie, which, again, is perfectly fine, but don't use fucking Batman and Superman for it. If there's one thing to take away from Snyder's DCEU, it's this. Take your time. More specifically, use the little time you have efficiently. I don't have to tell you that it's probably not the best idea to do the Trinity and the death of Superman in the second movie, and the Justice League in the fifth one, but that doesn't mean you can't do it. The issue lies more in how it's executed. Take Man of Steel, runtime of about 143 minutes. The first 20 minutes are spent on a different planet with characters we barely interact with after. About 30 minutes of it are spent on pure action. Shave off 10 minutes from the credits, and that leaves about 83 minutes to work with. Sadly, due to inefficient use of flashbacks, slow motion, and quick breaks to let the Jesus symbolism sink in, even this isn't utilized to that much effect. To be completely fair, Batman v Superman does make slight improvements on use of its runtime. There are similar issues with the inefficient use of flashbacks and slow motion, as well as the extensive action sequences in the third act, but all in all, it's a decently structured film. If it weren't for the insistence on introducing Wonder Woman, the rest of the Justice League, and the whole New Gods thing, that is. All in all, Man of Steel and Batman v Superman are mixed bags. They look absolutely stunning, some of the best visual effects and cinematography at the time. The mise-en-scène, casting, editing, all on point. In other words, a lot of the form is excellent. Sadly, I can't say the same for the content. These are not faithful or respectful adaptations of these characters. They're bent to fit Snyder's grim worldview, and lose the qualities that make these characters themselves. Altogether, neither of these movies is unwatchable. Even if they are at times carried by the visuals, there is still a good to balance out the bad. I think a D-tier makes sense for these movies. I'm very unlikely to go back and watch them again, but I respect a lot of the work that went into it. And it definitely paid off, even if I find the story adaptations and underlying message to be repulsive. Now, to pick which I prefer over the other. As much as I detest the adaptation of a lot of characters in BVS that weren't in Man of Steel, I do prefer the story broadly. Some of the ideas are definitely executed better, and I generally find Lex Luthor a more enjoyable antagonist when compared to Zod. This all disconnected from how good it was as an adaptation. BVS used its runtime more efficiently, and I find that its intended use of the characters is more interesting, even if I don't like that intention. Well, thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of this video. This is the first of a series, so make sure to, subscribe and stick around for the rest of the series. The next video will be on Suicide Squad and its sequel, The Suicide Squad. Until then, remember to not let your dad die in a tornado. Have a good one.